The difference between owing someone a favor and owing someone a debt is that the amount of a debt can be precisely calculated. Calculation demands equivalence, and such equivalence, especially when it involves equivalence between human beings, and it always seems to start that way, because at first human beings are always the ultimate values, only seems to occur when people have been forcibly severed from their contexts, so much so that they can be treated as identical to something else, as in 7 marten skins and 12 large silver rings for the return of your captured brother, one of your 3 daughters as surety for this loan of 150 bushels of grain. This in turn leads to that great embarrassing fact that haunts all attempts to represent the market as the highest form of human freedom, that historically impersonal commercial markets originate in theft. More than anything else, the endless recitation of the myth of barter, employed much like an incantation, is the economist's way of fending off any possibility of having to confront it. But even a moment's reflection makes it obvious. Who was the first man to look at a house full of objects and to immediately assess them only in terms of what he could trade them in for in the market likely to have been? Surely he can only have been a thief. Burglars, marauding soldiers, then perhaps debt collectors, were the first to see the world this way. It was only in the hands of soldiers, fresh from looting towns and cities, that chunks of gold or silver, melted down in most cases from some heirloom treasure, that, like the Kashmiri gods or Aztec breastplates or Babylonian women's ankle bracelets, was both a work of art and a little compendium of history, could become simple uniform bits of currency with no history, valuable precisely for their lack of history, because they could be accepted anywhere, no questions asked. And it continues to be true. Any system that reduces the world to numbers can only be held in place by weapons, whether these are swords and clubs or nowadays smart bombs from unmanned drones. It can also only operate by continually converting love into debt. I know my use of the word love here is even more provocative in its own way than communism. Still, it's important to hammer the point home. Just as markets, when allowed to drift entirely free from their violent origins, invariably begin to grow into something different, into networks of honor, trust, and mutual connectedness, so does the maintenance of systems of coercion constantly do the opposite. Turn the products of human cooperation, creativity, devotion, love, and trust back into numbers once again. In doing so, they make it possible to imagine a world that is nothing more than a series of cold-blooded calculations. Even more, by turning human sociality itself into debts, they transform the very foundations of our being, since what else are we ultimately except the sum of the relations we have with others, into matters of fault, sin, and crime, and making the world into a place of iniquity that can only be overcome by completing some great cosmic transaction that will annihilate everything. Trying to flip things around by asking, what do we owe society, or even trying to talk about our debt to nature, or some other manifestation of the cosmos, is a false solution. Really just a desperate scramble to salvage something from the very moral logic that has severed us from the cosmos to begin with. In fact, it's, if anything, the culmination of the process brought to a point of veritable dementia, since it's premised on the assumption that we're so absolutely, thoroughly disentangled from the world that we can just toss all other human beings, or all other living creatures even, or the cosmos, in a sack, and then start negotiating with them. It's hardly surprising that the end result, historically, is to see our life itself as something we hold on false premises, a loan long since overdue, and therefore to see existence itself as criminal. Insofar as there's a real crime here, though, it's fraud. The very premise is fraudulent. What could possibly be more presumptuous or more ridiculous than to think that it would be possible to negotiate with the grounds of one's existence? Of course it isn't. Insofar as it is indeed possible to come into any sort of relation with the absolute, we are confronting a principle that exists outside of time, or human scale time, entirely. Therefore, as medieval theologians correctly recognized, when dealing with the absolute, there can be no such thing as debt.